In part one of Mind, Consciousness and the God Question, we encountered the wonders of the human brain and mind.
The total number of possible connections within this human brain are greater than the number of particles in the known universe.
We probed the mysteries of human consciousness.
We actually don't know what consciousness is.
We don't have the basic idea of what a thought is. I cannot tell you molecularly or chemically what a thought is.
We investigated God consciousness and asked searching questions about religion, spirituality and superstition.
There is a sense of God's grace and presence and a sense of being loved, which is a profound and meaningful experience.
Even though I'm a religious believer, it seems to me religious beliefs, maybe in particular, need that extra scrutiny.
We debated if morality is a form of God consciousness.
Everybody can behave morally from where I sit, because everybody is made in the image of God as a moral being.
Are we naturally calibrated to have religious and spiritual experiences? And I think that the evidence suggests that we are.
What is at issue is whether or not there is a spiritual reality behind the universe.
In the God Question series, we're concerned with whether or not God is real. So far, much of the argument has centered on science and where the evidence points in the cosmos, in life sciences, in neuroscience. But there is evidence which is not so much scientific, but more rooted in personal experience.
That personal experience is the most important thing there is. So I would take it very seriously.
The central Christian claim is that God is a person, not a theory. And we react to persons in a different way from theories.
Valhalla, New York State, a center of the Catholic order Legionaries of Christ. Having rejected more lucrative careers and sacrificing the kind of relationships normally taken for granted, why are these young men dedicating 13 years of their lives to train for the priesthood?
The reason that they are here is because they have had in some way an encounter with Christ in their own lives. At some point they felt that call of God to give their lives to the service of others.
They claim to have had an encounter with God, but what does that really mean? What form does this encounter take?
You are aware somehow of the presence of someone in your soul and not something that's just from personal desire. Sometimes you're in a situation where you don't see what you should be doing, and you go to prayer and say, Lord, help me with this situation. And often in that context of spiritual openness, you will receive this sense of certainty about something, and about God's presence and about what God's will is for you. And a sense, again, of peace also with perhaps with the decision that you're trying to make. We have an experience of something beyond ourselves. Very often that kind of experience of the presence of God happens in the context of meditative prayer. If you're always listening to your iPod, if you're always on the phone, if you're always watching television, listening to the radio, you're so filled with noise that even if God is trying to talk to you, you can't hear him. But that atmosphere of silence and of prayer, others perhaps praying around you, is very conducive to being receptive to hearing the voice of God in your interior.
God is a lie, and people should not waste their time and waste their lives on it.
But religion doesn't just disable you, it honors the disability. It treats irrationality as a wonderful thing. It doesn't just excuse irrationality, it celebrates it.
When you hear some of these arguments of atheists, sometimes the thought, at least critics say, gee, maybe they're right, you know? But I always go back there to my experience of God in my own life. I have had many times experiences that seem humanly impossible to explain, if God isn't real. And so I think I also have rational reasons to at least say that my faith is not irrational.
Father Matthew Green doesn't claim to have seen or heard God physically, yet he believes in the reality of his spiritual experience. There must be some other basis for believing the experience is real.
According to the New Testament, there is such a thing as the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit. This is a kind of process that produces knowledge just as much as perception does, or memory does, or anything of the sort. It's not like just a leap in the dark.
I think that the fundamental way in which a person knows his faith to be true is through the inner testimony of God's Spirit to one's own spirit. God is a living person who I think spiritually speaks to the heart of every person if we'll simply be open to listen to his voice.
God has revealed himself to us not simply in creation, but by himself becoming human. So I don't think God is in that sense the great unknown. That assumes that he hasn't revealed himself.
But might faith and the religious experience associated with it have a purely physical explanation? A recent scientific study has suggested that a sense of God could be linked to a specific part of the brain, which, when activated, produces the sense of spiritual experience.
We somewhat playfully titled that the God gene. We went out and asked thousands of people questions about their feelings of spirituality. We took little samples of their DNA, looked at a lot of different genes, and we found one particular gene that was correlated with people's sense of spirituality. But it tends to tip the balance between people who are very spiritual and those who are less spiritual.
But there's considerable opposition to the view that spiritual consciousness can be explained simply in terms of genes.
When people are engaged in religious thought and religious practice and religious activity, it's not a particular part of the brain that's active. Recent studies are starting to show, look, it's the whole brain, lots of different parts of the brain, and it's not isolated to one little area or region, not one God spot.
There is no simple switch explanation for why some people believe in God and some don't. It would be wiser to look at their personal experiences than to be rummaging around in their brain.
The attempt to find a God gene is motivated by the expectation that science can explain spiritual consciousness. But philosopher Keith Ward argues that this is an area where we must recognize the limitations of science.
It's very important and gives you a lot of information about the world, but it is by definition restricted to one sort of reality, namely a sort of reality that everybody can observe. But what if there are phenomena which are not like that? God, for example, God being immaterial and not acting in accordance with regular, predictable laws, then that wouldn't come under the scope of science.
I think that either God invented man or man invented God. One of those two is probably correct. And I think it's important as scientists that we don't pretend that somehow we have a secret microscope or a secret measuring device that allows us to make that critical philosophical distinction.
Science is wonderful, and science provides a tremendous amount of knowledge and information about the world, but I think it also has its place. And what we also find is that ultimately when we talk about the human ability to accurately know what they're perceiving on the inside and whether or not that's accurate and compatible with what is out there in the real world, science is always trapped within our own brains, and therefore it never gets us to that, to be able to answer that philosophical question of how do we really know if what we perceive inside is really what's real.
Our minds and reason and evidence play a part, but not the only part, nor at times even the complete part. So we have to understand how we absorb information and realize that we come to decisions on a range and variety of data, and therefore experience and other factors contribute validly to the knowing process.
Consciousness remains a mystery which scientists continue to probe. The enigma is not just where it comes from, but does it continue after we die? Not surprisingly, some studies are focusing on the experience of people who have reached the point of death, and whose experience might therefore provide crucial pointers towards whether it really is the end of all consciousness. Neuropsychiatrist Peter Fenwick is a leading authority on the mental states of the dying. He investigates patients' reports of their experiences as life is ending.
We know about death because we've studied it. First of all, we've collected stories. We've got about 2,000 accounts from relatives of the dying about what happens when people die. What we have found is that the dying process is not as we think. It's not just a switching off. There's some very interesting phenomena which occur.
People in about 24 hours or so prior to death sometimes seem to have an experience of seeing their deceased relatives. And this has been described often by hospice workers or nurses who take care of patients, or even families.
But investigation into the experience of dying can go one step further. It focuses on patients who have been clinically dead and then successfully resuscitated.
Signs of breathing? Yes. He is, right. Yeah. Marvellous.
Their reports of experiences during the time of clinical death is crucially important in shedding light in an area of deep mystery.
Death is defined when the heart stops beating, and as a consequence, a person stops breathing immediately, and the brain also shuts down. There is no electrical activity, you get a flatline electrical silence state. And so at that time, we would expect there to be no activity of the mind or consciousness. However, what we have observed is that a proportion of people do indeed have this ability to have thought processes, memories, reasoning, and very detailed recall of what had objectively happened when they had reached the point of death.
Ken Spearpoint and Gilly Traynor are members of the resuscitation team at Hammersmith Hospital, London. When they're called in, the situation is literally a matter of life or death.
They're all technically dead at the point at which we start compressing their chest. At 1 in 10 of them report anecdotally they feel as though they've taken a journey through a tunnel. They describe this sense of well-being, of unbelievable well-being, and ultimately they end up in a wonderful place. And this phenomena appears to cross the whole range of cultural beliefs.
A small number of patients assessed as clinically dead also report being detached from their bodies and able to see the resuscitation itself.
Now, this is extraordinarily interesting, because if the brain isn't working, but yet people can gather information, then it's absolutely fundamental.
This underlying question is of great importance to science and to the God question.
If you switch the brain off and you can demonstrate scientifically the mind also switches off, then you've proven that the mind is produced from the brain. If on the other hand you switch the brain off and the mind and consciousness is still continuing, then you've demonstrated that it must be a separate, undiscovered scientific entity, and that's what we're trying to do.
Don Piper understands something of near-death experience. He believes he had one.
If I'd have just turned left that day, a truck, an articulated lorry, is coming in the other direction, and he's driving very fast. He loses control of the truck and strikes my car. Everything they knew to do, they tried to do to resuscitate me. They were unsuccessful. I was pronounced dead on the scene of the accident. While the body lay there, I was absent from the body. And I had the rare and extreme privilege of glimpsing heaven.
Don Piper's otherworldly experience was short-lived, a mere 90 minutes. But for him, the brevity has not compromised the reality.
The accident happened at 11:45 a.m. at 1:15 p.m. and I'm back.
For Don's story to have any credibility, he had to be dead. But why so sure?
There was an extremely large group of people working on me that day. So I would just say they all couldn't have been wrong. They were utterly convinced that I was a fatality. I know I was gone.
He could be deluded. He could be making the whole thing up. Or he could have had a brain experience that he thought he was in heaven. I mean, people have heaven experiences almost every night. Everybody goes to sleep and then they have dreams. which seem extremely real, very, very real. Like you can wake up in a dead sweat, they seem so real, but they weren't real.
From their perspective, I could see why they would think it would be a delusion. From my perspective, it's the most real thing that ever happened to me, really. More real than this conversation we're having right now.
Naturally, the reliability of reports about near-death experience are challenged by some scientists.
My understanding is that near-death experiences, which are also sometimes adduced to as a kind of support for the existence of a soul that can survive separately from the body, can all be explained as cases of what happens when the brain is deprived of oxygen as its physiology starts to wind down.
I can certainly imagine that when dying, all these things could start collapsing, so you would have extremely weird experiences of where you were and what was happening.
And so the fascinating question is, are these experiences real or not? The preliminary findings suggest that the people who believe that there's nothing instantly as soon as you die are probably not correct, because the evidence suggests that at least for the early period of death, mind and consciousness is continuing.
We have accounts from some people who have been atheists all their lives and said there is nothing, and turned at the moment of death to say to their family, I was wrong.
Near-death experience might provide an intriguing way of investigating life after death, but Sylvia Glover believes clear evidence of God exists in the here and now. Sylvia is convinced she has personally experienced God transforming her life.
Well, it started out as a little girl being rejected by my father, and because of that, I really searched for love all my life. I started drinking at a really young age. I started doing drugs, hanging out in nightclubs and places that a little girl really shouldn't be. Most of my friends at that time were drug dealers, and I never really had to pay for drugs. You know, drugs were always easily available to me. As I grew up, as I got older, I was working at a brokerage firm, and it was there that I had a manager who was a Christian.
One more time, can we put our hands together and just bless our God? You're awesome.
She had a joy and a peace that I had never experienced before. And over the course of years, she would invite me to church, and I kept refusing to go. She continued to invite me to church, and finally I accepted. So I showed up at the Brooklyn Tabernacle one Sunday, and the moment that I walked into that place, I knew that there was something different. I could sense the love of God, and I felt like my search had ended, that this was the thing that I needed. The choir sung, Pastor Simla spoke, and it was like he was speaking to me. I felt like there was no one else in the whole sanctuary but me. And he talked about the love of God, the very thing that I needed to hear. At the end of the message, he asked, is there anyone in the building who wants to give their heart to the Lord and experience this love? So I responded to the altar call, and right there at that altar, I knew that my life had been changed. When I went to work the next day, they knew that something happened to me because there was a change in my countenance. There was a joy and a peace that I never had before, and I had now had experienced. The only way to really describe it is just an inner knowing, an inner ability to recognize, that it was God.
Sylvia's experience is far from being an isolated one. Darrington Prison in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Locked up inside are some of America's most dangerous prisoners. But the gates have been opened to Prison Fellowship, an organization aiming to connect prisoners with Christian faith in the hope of bringing real change to their lives.
These are some of the worst offenders in the system. Guys here have life sentences. Guys here have spent, a lot of them, 20, 25, maybe even 30 years incarcerated.
Doing things that if I'd have been in my right mind, I probably never would have even dreamed of doing. I jumped in the river with handcuffs on. I tried to make the police kill me.
I had no reason to live.
Despite the serious and often violent levels of crime involved, more than 60 prisoners in Darrington Jail claim their lives have been transformed through a prison fellowship program that encouraged them to open their minds to God.
We have seen some miraculous changes in a lot of people's lives, and I believe that putting God first will always change things.
I sincerely prayed, God, help me, clean me up. Man, I'm no good.
I'm no longer rebellious against the things that are morally just and right.
And I asked God to give me the strength to change my life, because I really want to change my life.
I've seen ex-gang members, ex-gang leaders, guys who were not only experiencing hits on their lives, but placing hits on other people's lives. I've seen them lay all of that down.
Once a senior member of the Nixon government in Washington, Chuck Colson was found guilty of involvement in the Watergate scandal and sent to prison.
I was a tough politician, a political leader, known as the White House hatchet man, which meant I was the tough guy in the Nixon White House.